Blood smells exactly like rusted plumbing and dirty pennies. Maeve knew this because her polyester apron was currently heavy with it. She wasn't a killer. She was a deeply exhausted waitress at a highway diner who just wanted her graveyard shift to end. But when 3 men with suppressed weapons cornered the bleeding stranger in her section, she didn't reach for the silent alarm. She reached for the warm, heavy steel resting on his lap. And she pulled the trigger, bleach and burnt filter paper. That was the eternal scent of the Starlight Diner at 3 in the morning. Maeve dragged a frayed grey rag across the laminate counter, pressing hard enough to make her knuckles ache, though the coffee stains had set in years ago. The harsh, fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a persistent insect-like hum that burrowed right into the base of her skull. She was 26, running on 4 hours of sleep and entirely numb to the misery of the graveyard shift off Interstate 95. Rain lashed against the greasy plate glass windows, obscuring the empty parking lot. Behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, the deep fryer bubbled quietly, keeping a lonely rhythm with the snoring of Artie the line cook, who had passed out on a milk crate 2 hours prior. When the front door chimed, the sound was unnaturally loud in the dead space. Maeve didn't look up immediately. She kept scrubbing the counter, counting the seconds, giving the customer time to pick a seat. Only when the wet, heavy thud of work boots stopped moving did she lift her chin. He chose booth 3. The darkest corner tucked behind a fake potted ficus that hadn't been dusted since the 90s. Maeve grabbed a cracked ceramic mug and the decanter of regular drip, walking over with the slow, deliberate drag of someone who traded their enthusiasm for minimum wage. As she approached, the sensory details clicked into place, one by one. First, the water pooling around his dark leather boots wasn't just rain. In the dim light, the droplets catching on the cracked linoleum had a thick, dark viscosity. Second, the man was breathing too deliberately. It was a shallow, controlled intake of air released through clenched teeth. He looked to be in his early 30s. He wore a tailored wool overcoat that looked like it cost more than Maeve's car, but the fabric on the left side was torn, the edges stiff and blackened. His face was sharp, pale, and entirely devoid of warmth. Dark hair clung to his forehead in wet, chaotic strands. His eyes, when they finally flicked up to meet hers, were the color of slate under winter ice. They didn't hold a plea for help. They held an absolute, terrifying stillness. "Coffee," he said. His voice was a low rasp, dry as crushed gravel. Maeve didn't ask if he was okay. Living in the outskirts of a city that breathed crime, you learned early that asking questions was an invitation to become collateral damage. She flipped the mug over and poured the black liquid. The steam rose, carrying the bitter acidic smell of beans that had been roasting on the burner for too long. "Cream or sugar?" she asked, her voice flat, mirroring his emptiness. Black. As he reached for the mug, his coat shifted. The fluorescent light caught the metallic edge of something tucked into his waistband. A handgun. Not a cheap street piece, but a heavy, matte black semi-automatic. Maeve's heart gave a dull, singular thump against her ribs, but her face didn't change. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop the pot. Her brain simply processed the threat and filed it away in the same mental compartment reserved for drunk truckers and aggressive drifters. Panic was a luxury for people who didn't have rent due on Tuesday. "You're bleeding on the vinyl," Maeve pointed out, keeping her tone conversational. The man, Roman Hayes, though she wouldn't know his name or the empire he violently commanded, until much later glanced down. A dark stain was indeed spreading across the faded red seat cushion. "I'll leave an extra tip," Roman murmured, taking a sip of the scalding coffee without flinching. "Make sure it covers upholstery cleaner," Maeve said, stepping back. "I'm not scrubbing that up for a $5 bill." A muscle in his jaw twitched. It might have been amusement. It might have been a spasm of agony. Maeve turned her back on him and walked behind the counter. She placed the coffee pot back on the warmer. Her hands were trembling slightly, just a microscopic vibration in her fingers. She pressed them flat against the cool metal of the cash register to steady them. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the storm outside. Maeve stood near the register, pretending to reorganize a stack of paper napkins, but her peripheral vision remained locked on booth 3. Roman hadn't touched his coffee again. He was leaning his head back against the faux wood, paneling, his eyes half closed. The pallor of his skin was worsening, taking on a grey, waxy sheen under the brutal overhead lighting. He was dying. She realized it with a detached sort of clarity. The man in her booth was quietly bleeding out, too stubborn or too hunted to go to a hospital. She thought about dialing 911. She looked at the greasy landline phone resting next to the credit card machine. If she called the cops, the diner would be locked down. Artie would get woken up. She'd be stuck here, filling out statements until dawn, missing her second job at the grocery store. And the man in the corner might just shoot her for lifting the receiver. Maeve exhaled a slow, shaky breath. She grabbed a clean towel, ran it under the cold water tap, and walked back over to booth 3. She tossed the wet towel onto the table. It landed next to his coffee mug with a soft slap. "Press that against it," Maeve said, looking out the window into the black night. "You're getting blood on the floor now, too." Roman opened his eyes. The slate-grey intensity returned, narrowing as he stared at the damp cloth. He looked at Maeve, dissecting her apathetic facade, searching for the crack in her armor. Slowly, with a grimace that finally betrayed his pain, he reached up, took the towel and shoved it under his coat against his ribcage. "Thank you," he breathed. Maeve just nodded, turning to walk away. But as she pivoted, a pair of headlights swept across the diner's front windows, cutting through the heavy rain. A sleek, dark sedan rolled into the parking lot, coming to a halt directly outside the glass doors. The engine cut off, but the lights stayed on, glaring blindly into the diner. Maeve froze. The hair on her arms stood up. She tasted copper at the back of her throat. In booth 3, Roman shifted. The low, ragged sound of his breathing stopped entirely. The heavy glass door of the diner opened, the bell chiming with a cheerful, innocent jingle that felt violently out of place. 3 men stepped out of the freezing rain. They didn't shake off their umbrellas or wipe their boots on the welcome mat. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. The air in the diner instantly changed the smell of ozone and wet asphalt rolling in, swallowing the scent of bleach and stale coffee. They wore dark raincoats, but beneath the open collars, Maeve could see the sharp lines of tailored suits. They weren't looking at the menu board. They weren't looking at Maeve. Their eyes, cold, flat, and predatory, were locked on the shadowed corner of booth 3. Maeve was standing paralyzed halfway between the counter and the tables, a handful of plastic straws clutched in her fist. Her stomach dropped into a bottomless gorge. The silence in the room became a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. The man in the lead, a towering figure with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, reached inside his wet coat. When his hand emerged, it was wrapped around a matte black pistol fitted with a long cylindrical suppressor. The 2 men flanking him mirrored the movement. It was happening too fast, yet every microsecond felt agonizingly slow. Maeve saw the drops of water falling from the lead man's sleeve. She heard the wet squeak of his rubber soles on the linoleum. "Don't move, sweetheart," the scarred man said softly, not even glancing her way. His voice was entirely devoid of adrenaline. It was a day at the office. In booth 3, Roman moved. It was supposed to be a fluid, practiced motion. He reached for the heavy weapon tucked into his waistband, intending to draw and fire in a single breath. But his body betrayed him. The blood loss had drained the electricity from his muscles. His fingers, slick with his own blood from holding the towel, fumbled against the grip. His elbow knocked violently against the edge of the table. The coffee mug tipped, sending a river of scalding black liquid over the edge. And the gun slipped. It fell from his clumsy grip, clattering against the metal leg of the table before hitting the sticky floor. It spun across the scuffed linoleum, coming to a dead stop exactly halfway between Roman's heavy boots and Maeve's cheap white sneakers. Time fractured. Maeve looked down at the weapon. It was terrifying up close, a brutal, heavy chunk of engineering designed solely to tear through human flesh. She looked up. The scarred man was raising his suppressed weapon, leveling it directly at Roman's chest. The hitman's eyes briefly flicked to Maeve. It was a look of pure, indifferent calculation. He was doing the math. Kill the target, then kill the waitress to leave no witnesses. It would cost him nothing. Maeve's mind didn't conjure up heroic fantasies. She didn't think about saving the handsome, bleeding stranger. She thought about her cramped apartment. She thought about her overdue electric bill. She thought with a sudden, violently raw surge of indignation, I am not dying on a Tuesday night in this filthy diner. She dropped the plastic straws. They fluttered toward the floor like cheap confetti. Maeve didn't step forward. She threw her entire body weight downward, dropping to her knees. The impact sent a jarring spike of pain up her shins, but she didn't care. Her hand, pale and trembling, clamped down on the grip of Roman's gun. It was warm. It smelled heavily of gun oil and iron. "Hey!" The scarred man barked, his focus snapping toward her. He adjusted his aim, swinging the long barrel down toward her kneeling form. Maeve didn't know anything about proper stances. She didn't know about trigger discipline or sight alignment. She simply yanked the heavy weapon upward with both hands, aimed it at the center of the dark raincoat, closed her eyes, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was catastrophic in the enclosed space. Without a suppressor, the gunshot was a physical concussive force. It punched Maeve in the chest, the violent recoil snapping her wrists back and sending a shockwave of pain up her forearms. Her ears instantly filled with a high-pitched, agonizing whine that drowned out the hum of the neon lights. She opened her eyes, gasping for air that suddenly tasted like sulfur and burned dust. The scarred man was staggering backward. He didn't cry out. The force of the hollow point round had struck him square in the collarbone, ripping through muscle and bone. A grotesque spray of dark crimson painted the glass pastry display case behind him. He dropped his weapon, his hands flying to his ruined throat as he collapsed backward, crashing hard against a spinning stool. The diner erupted into chaos. The two remaining hitmen flinched, momentarily stunned by the deafening blast and the sudden, impossible reality that the terrified waitress had just blown their leader apart. That microsecond of hesitation was all Roman needed. Adrenaline overriding his failing body, he lunged forward out of the booth. He didn't have a weapon, but he had momentum. He crashed into the nearest gunman, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs. They slammed violently into the jukebox, the glass front shattering inward, triggering a chaotic shower of sparks and a warped, skipping country song. Maeve was still on her knees, her chest heaving, the heavy gun smoking in her hands. The smell of blood and cordite was suffocating. She looked at the man she had just shot. He was writhing on the floor, his slick blood mixing with the dirty rainwater. Her stomach rolled. She leaned over, fighting the immediate urge to vomit, her hands shaking so violently the gun rattled against the floorboards. The third gunman, recovering his wits, ignored Roman and swung his weapon directly at Maeve's head. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. Before Maeve could even raise the gun again, a heavy glass coffee decanter materialized from the peripheral shadows. Artie the cook, awakened by the gunshot, had burst from the kitchen. He brought the heavy pot down on the back of the third gunman's skull with a sickening crunch. Glass exploded. Boiling coffee and blood rained down. The man folded in half, dropping like a stone. Roman, covered in sweat and bleeding heavily from his torn stitches, managed to wrench the second gunman's weapon free and delivered a brutal, blunt strike to the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. Suddenly the diner was still. The only sounds were the skipping jukebox record, the hiss of spilled coffee hitting the hot griddle in the back, and the ragged, desperate panting of three very traumatized people. Roman leaned heavily against the shattered jukebox, clutching his bleeding side. He looked at the bodies on the floor, then slowly turned his gaze to Maeve. She was still kneeling in the dirt, and the blood staring at the smoking gun in her hands with wide, horrified eyes. He took a slow, agonizing breath, the corner of his pale mouth twitching upward in a grim, blood-stained smirk. "Nice shot," he rasped. Shock didn't feel cold like they always said in the movies. It felt like walking underwater in a heavy winter coat. Maeve dropped the pistol. It hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the soles of her cheap sneakers. Her hands were still locked in the shape of the grip fingers, cramped and white-knuckled. A sharp, acidic burn climbed her throat. She didn't try to stop it. She turned away from the man with the ruined chest, dropped to her hands and knees near the prep counter, and dry heaved violently. Nothing came up but the bitter taste of stale diner coffee and bile. She spat, wiping her mouth with a trembling forearm, leaving a smear of grease and someone else's blood across her pale skin. Behind her, Artie was making a sound like a deflating tire, a continuous, high-pitched wheeze. He stood over the man he had struck with the coffee pot, still clutching the plastic handle of the shattered decanter. "I hit him," Artie stammered, staring at the brown sludge and blood pooling around the man's head. "Maeve, I hit a guy." "Breathe, Artie," she croaked, though her own lungs felt filled with wet cement. Footsteps scuffed against the floor. Roman Hayes limped rather toward the cash register. He bypassed the bodies without a downward glance, as if stepping over piles of damp laundry. He reached over the counter with his uninjured arm, yanking the cord of the landline phone straight out of the wall. He tossed the dead receiver onto the grill. "What are you doing?" Maeve asked. Her voice sounded distant, disconnected from her own vocal cords. "Buying time," Roman said. He leaned heavily against the stainless steel counter, his breath coming in ragged, shallow pools. His face was the color of dirty chalk, but his hands moved with frantic, terrifying purpose. He pulled a burner phone from his coat pocket, his thumb swiping across the cracked screen. He pressed it to his ear. "Declan, Starlight Diner on 95. 3 dead, 1 maybe breathing. I need a scrub team 4 minutes ago. Bring the armored car." He paused, listening. "I don't care about the local precinct. Pay the captain. Just get here." He snapped the phone shut and finally looked at Maeve. She was still kneeling, staring at the gore smeared across the pastry case, a cherry pie squashed beneath shattered glass and red spray. "You can't stay here," Roman stated. Maeve blinked, looking up at him. "It's my shift. I don't get off until 6. It was a stupid thing to say. A hilariously, tragically stupid thing to say, surrounded by 3 bleeding hitmen. But her brain had short-circuited, retreating to the safety of routine. Roman's mouth tightened. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, cutting a clean line through the soot and rain on his cheek. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that demanded focus. "Those men belong to the Kovac syndicate. They are not going to care that you were just defending yourself. They will look at the cameras, they will find your address, and they will skin you alive in your own bathtub just to make a point." Maeve felt a violent tremor start in her knees and radiate upward. "I'll call the police. It was self-defense." "The police on this payroll will hand you over to Kovac before you even make it to a holding cell," Roman replied brutally. He gestured to the door. "My crew is 2 minutes out. They are going to sanitize this room. They're going to erase the security footage. Artie, he snapped, turning to the terrified cook. Artie jumped, dropping the plastic handle. Roman pulled a thick, bloody roll of cash from his trouser pocket and tossed it onto the counter. There's 10 grand in there. You saw nothing. A drunk trucker broke the glass. You went back to sleep. You understand? Artie stared at the money, then at Roman, nodding so fast, his jowls shook. Drunk trucker. Yes, sir. Wait. Maeve scrambled to her feet, her sneakers slipping slightly in the mess. I can't just leave. I have a life. I have an apartment. I have a cat. I'll buy you a new cat, Roman said, pushing off the counter. The movement tore something in his side. He hissed, grabbing his ribs, his knees buckling slightly. Maeve, acting entirely on a stupid, ingrained instinct to help, stepped forward and caught his elbow. His arm was corded iron beneath the wet wool. He smelled like gunpowder, expensive cedarwood cologne, and the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. There was no gratitude there. Only a cold, calculating assessment. You saved my life, Roman said softly, the word sounding almost painful to admit. Which means you're my liability now. You walk out that door alone. You're dead by sunrise. Headlights swept through the rain much brighter than the last set. 3 black SUVs, large and menacing as tanks, rolled into the parking lot. The doors opened simultaneously. Men in dark utilitarian clothing stepped out carrying heavy duffel bags and bleach. They moved with the same synchronized efficiency as the killers, but these men belonged to Roman. A tall man with broad shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard jogged into the diner. He didn't carry a gun, but he radiated an imposing, quiet violence. This was Declan. He took one look at the carnage, then looked at Roman. Cars running, Declan said. He finally noticed Maeve, his eyes scanning her blood-splattered apron and trembling hands. Who's the stray? She's coming with us, Roman said. Maeve wanted to scream. She wanted to run out the back door into the woods and never stop. But she looked at the dead man's ruined throat. She looked at the blood on her own palms. The mundane, exhausting life she had hated 4 minutes ago was gone, shattered completely by the squeeze of a heavy trigger. She untied the strings of her apron and let it fall to the floor. Rain hammered the roof of the armored SUV, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against a tin drum. Inside, the silence was absolute. Maeve sat stiffly in the back seat, her knees pressed tightly together. The interior smelled intensely of fresh, expensive leather and something distinctly antiseptic. It was a sterile, isolated pod gliding silently through the storm. The tinted windows were so dark she couldn't see the highway markers passing by, stripping her of any sense of direction. Beside her, Roman was losing his battle with gravity. He had refused to lie down, stubbornly propping himself in the corner of the seat, but his chin kept dipping toward his chest. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. Declan was in the driver's seat, handling the massive vehicle with aggressive precision, checking the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. We're 10 minutes from the clinic, Declan announced, his voice coming through a small speaker in the soundproof partition, separating the front from the back. Faster. Roman muttered, his eyes squeezed shut. Maeve stared at her hands. They were still coated in dried blood, flaking off like rust against her skin. She rubbed her thumb against her index finger, feeling the gritty texture. She was 26 years old. She had never been in a fist fight. The most violent thing she had ever done was swat a mosquito on her neck. Now a man was lying dead on a diner floor because her finger had pulled a metal lever. She didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel like a survivor. She felt profoundly, deeply sick. A sudden jolt in the road sent Roman sliding sideways. He groaned a raw, guttural sound of pure agony and slumped against the center console. The thick wool of his coat had soaked through, entirely leaving a dark, slick smear against the pale beige leather of the seat. "Hey!" Maeve said, her voice cracking. She reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before grabbing his shoulder and pushing him back upright. "Hey, you can't bleed out on me. Not after you dragged me into this stupid car." Roman's eyelids fluttered. The slate grey of his irises was clouded, unfocused. "Bossy. For a waitress," he slurred. "I'm not a waitress right now. I'm a hostage." Maeve snapped her fear, converting rapidly into a jagged defensive anger. She looked down at his side. The temporary towel she had given him was soaked black. "You're bleeding faster." "Declan," Roman managed to say, but his voice was too weak to carry to the microphone. Maeve didn't wait for permission. She unzipped his heavy wool overcoat, her bloody fingers fumbling with the expensive fabric. Beneath it, his white dress shirt was ruined, plastered to his skin. She grabbed the collar and ripped the fabric downward. Buttons popped, pinging against the tinted windows. The wound was ugly. It was a jagged tear just below his ribs, surrounded by a terrifying expanse of purple and black bruising. It wasn't a neat, clean bullet hole. The bullet had fragmented, tearing muscle and tissue. It was pumping a steady, rhythmic stream of dark red with every beat of his heart. Maeve grabbed a thick, plush leather throw pillow from the adjacent seat. It probably cost more than her monthly rent. She didn't care. She slammed the pillow directly against the wound and pushed down with both hands, using her entire upper body weight. Roman screamed. It wasn't a dignified sound. It was a raw, visceral roar of pain that filled the cabin. His hand shot out, clamping around Maeve's wrist with bone-crushing force. His grip was a vice, his fingers digging into her tendons. "Don't touch it!" He gasped, his teeth bared in an animalistic grimace. "Let go of me!" Maeve fired back, her own adrenaline spiking. She didn't pull away. She pushed down harder on the pillow. "You're going to die in the back of this fancy car, and then your giant friend up front is going to kill me for letting it happen. So let go of my wrist and bleed into the pillow." Roman stared at her, his chest heaving under her hands. He was a man used to absolute compliance. People didn't yell at him. They certainly didn't rip his clothes and bark orders while covered in diner grease. For a long, tense second, she thought he might snap her wrist just to prove a point. Instead, the tension slowly bled out of his arm. His grip loosened his hand, falling heavily onto his thigh. He let his head roll back against the headrest, staring at the dark, suede ceiling. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice, barely a whisper over the sound of the tires on wet asphalt. "Maeve. Maeve," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "I hate the name Maeve." "I hate guys who bleed on my section," she retorted, keeping the pressure steady. Her arms were beginning to ache, a dull burn settling into her biceps. "We're even." The SUV banked sharply, the tires squealing in protest as they descended down a steep concrete ramp. The rain suddenly cut off, replaced by the hollow, echoing acoustics of an underground parking garage. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting rapid, strobing shadows across Roman's pale face. Declan slammed on the brakes. Before the vehicle even rocked to a complete halt, the heavy doors were pulled open from the outside. Men in surgical scrubs, incongruously mixed with men wearing tactical vests, surrounded the car. They dragged a gurney toward the open door. Maeve let go of the pillow, tumbling backward out of the way, as two men hauled Roman's heavy frame out of the SUV. He was unconscious now, his head lolling sideways. They slammed him onto the gurney, shouting medical jargon she didn't understand, and sprinted toward a heavy steel door marked Freight Elevator. Maeve sat alone in the back of the SUV. The expensive beige leather was a ruined, catastrophic mess of red. The engine hummed quietly. Declan appeared in the doorway, staring down at her. His face was unreadable. "Get out," he said quietly. Maeve looked at her blood-stained hands, then up at the imposing man. The diner felt like a lifetime ago. She stepped out onto the cold concrete, stepping fully into the dark. Concrete dust and exhaust fumes. That was what the underworld actually smelled like. Maeve sat alone in the ruined back seat of the SUV, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest to stop the violent shivering. The engine had ticked into silence. The heavy steel door marked "Freight Elevator" remained shut. For a long, stretched-out eternity, there was only the dripping of water from the vehicle's undercarriage onto the concrete floor. Her hands felt tight, the drying blood acting like a second stiff skin. She rubbed her thumb against her index finger again. The friction produced a faint, papery rustle. When the freight doors finally groaned open, Declan emerged. Without the chaotic backdrop of the diner, Maeve could see the details she'd missed. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad frame flawlessly, though the knees were damp from the rain. His face was a stoic mask of tired professionalism, the kind of expression worn by men who cleaned up catastrophic messes for a living. He walked to the open door of the SUV and stopped looking at the blood-soaked beige leather, then at Maeve. "Come on," Declan said, his voice flat. Maeve didn't argue. Her legs felt like hollow aluminum pipes as she slid out of the vehicle. Her cheap sneakers hit the cold concrete with a pathetic squeak. She followed Declan toward the heavy doors, the fluorescent lights overhead, emitting a high insectoid whine that gnawed at her migraine. The space beyond the elevator wasn't a hospital. It was a subterranean bunker with cinder block walls painted an institutional depressing seafoam green. It smelled aggressively of industrial bleach and iodine layered over the faint, metallic tang of old copper. A makeshift triage center occupied the center of the room, cordoned off by heavy plastic sheeting. Behind the opaque plastic, harsh surgical lights, blazed and muffled, urgent voices barked requests for clamps and saline. Declan pointed down a narrow corridor. "Second door on the right. Wash up. Leave the clothes in the red bin." He handed her a tightly folded bundle of fabric. Maeve took it automatically. She walked down the hallway, pushed open the door, and locked it behind her. The bathroom was entirely stainless steel, a heavy-duty sink, a toilet, and a floor drain. There was no mirror. People who came here didn't want to look at themselves. Maeve set the bundle on the back of the toilet. She turned on the heavy tap, letting the water run until it turned icy cold. She plunged her hands under the stream. The water immediately turned a violent, diluted pink. It swirled around the drain in a mesmerizing, sickening vortex. Maeve grabbed a block of harsh pumice soap from a wire dish and scrubbed. She dug her fingernails into her palms, scraping at the dried rust, caked in the creases of her knuckles. She scrubbed until her skin burned red and raw, until the water ran perfectly clear, but she still felt the phantom heat of the gun grip in her right hand. She stripped off the blood-stiffened polyester uniform. It felt like peeling off a husk. She threw it underwear and all into the heavy plastic biohazard bin in the corner. The clothes Declan had given her were men's medium, grey fleece sweatpants and a heavy black cotton t-shirt. They smelled faintly of fabric softener and gun oil. She pulled them on. The shirt hung past her thighs, the collar swallowing her collarbones. She looked like a child playing dress-up in a war zone. When she stepped back out into the corridor, the adrenaline crash hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her knees buckled. She slapped a hand against the painted cinder block wall to stay upright, her vision graying at the edges. Declan was waiting near a bank of vinyl waiting room chairs. He watched her sway, his expression entirely devoid of pity. He pushed a small paper cup toward her, across a laminate side table. "Drink," he commanded. Maeve stumbled over and sank into the vinyl chair. It sighed under her weight. She picked up the cup. It wasn't water, it was orange juice, heavily spiked with sugar. She downed it in one agonizingly sweet gulp. The sugar hit her bloodstream, dulling the edges of the grey fuzz in her peripheral vision. "Is he dead?" Maeve asked, staring at the empty paper cup. "No." Declan replied, sitting in the chair opposite hers. He was meticulously dismantling a handgun, not the suppressed weapon from the diner, but a smaller, blockier piece. The metallic snick-clack of the slide being removed was oddly rhythmic. Harrison stopped the bleeding. Bullet fragmented. Missed his lung by a fraction of an inch. And the men at the diner, being handled. Declan wiped down a spring with a small cloth. He didn't look up. "Your apartment is also being handled. You have an orange tabby cat. Missing half its left ear." Maeve's head snapped up a fresh spike of panic, piercing through her exhaustion. "Barnaby, if you touch my cat, a team packed your essentials. The cat is currently in a carrier in the back of an armored van, screaming at my driver," Declan interrupted smoothly. "Roman gave explicit orders to secure your life. You don't have an apartment anymore, Maeve. The Kovac Syndicate will burn that building to the foundation, just to see if you crawl out." Maeve pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The cheap fleece of the sweatpants was warm, but she was freezing from the inside out. Her life, the miserable, predictable cycle of rent and tips and bus schedules, had been vaporized in the span of 30 minutes. "I want to see him," Maeve said, dropping her hands. Her voice shook, but the demand was clear. Declan paused his cleaning. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his dark eyes cataloguing the jut of her jaw and the stubborn set of her shoulders. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't hysterical. "He's under heavy sedation," Declan said. "I don't care," Maeve replied, leaning forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "He owes me a conversation. And I'm not sitting in this hallway waiting for permission. Medical tape rubbing alcohol and the sharp acidic tang of burnt ozone. The recovery room behind the heavy plastic sheeting felt like a meat locker. The air conditioning was cranked down to an aggressive shivering chill. Maeve stood in the doorway, her hands buried deep in the pockets of the oversized grey sweatpants. The only sound was the steady rhythmic blip of a heart monitor and the quiet hiss of an oxygen concentrator. Roman Hayes was lying in the center of the room on a raised mechanical hospital bed. He looked drastically different from the terrifying force of nature in the diner. Stripped of the expensive wool coat and the commanding posture, he was just a severely damaged man. His chest was wrapped in thick white gauze, a patchwork of stark white against the bruised, yellowing canvas of his skin. An IV line snaked into the back of his right hand, dripping a clear narcotic cocktail into his veins. His eyes were closed, the dark lashes casting long shadows against his unnaturally pale cheekbones. Maeve took a slow step into the room. She didn't want to wake him, but she needed to look at him to confirm this was real, that she hadn't just murdered a man in a fever dream. As her sneaker squeaked slightly against the linoleum, Roman's eyes snapped open. There was no groggy transition between sleep and wakefulness. His slate-grey irises locked onto her, instantly sharp and completely lucid, cutting through the heavy haze of whatever painkillers Dr. Harrison had pumped into him. "You look terrible," Roman rasped. His voice was raw, like he had been gargling broken glass. "I'm wearing your guard's clothes, and I smell like bleach," Maeve shot back, crossing her arms defensively. The oversized T-shirt swallowed her movement. "You look like you lost a fight with a meat grinder." A very faint, painful smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He shifted slightly, suppressing a wince as the movement pulled at his stitches. He reached over with his good arm and hit a button on the side of the bed. The top half slowly elevated, bringing him to a seated position. It cost him visible effort, his jaw clenching hard, but he refused to lie flat while speaking to her. "Declan tells me your cat is terrorizing my transport team," Roman said, breathing heavily through his nose once the bed stopped moving. "Barnaby gets motion sickness," Maeve replied flatly. "And he bites." "Fitting." Roman closed his eyes for a brief second, gathering his strength. When he opened them, the faint amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, transactional gravity. "We need to talk about the man whose chest you hollowed out." Maeve's stomach plummeted, a cold stone dropping into her bowels. She tightened her grip on her own arms. "Your friend Declan said he was Kovac." "Victor Kovac, the underboss of the largest trafficking syndicate on the eastern seaboard," Roman corrected smoothly. "The man you shot was his nephew Elias. Elias was stupid, vicious, and entirely devoid of tactical skill. But he was blood. Which means you didn't just kill a hitman, you murdered royalty." The walls of the sterile room suddenly felt too close. The humming of the oxygen machine grew deafening. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. "I was trying to save my own life. The Mafia does not care about intent, Maeve. They only care about ledgers. A life was taken. A life is owed." Roman watched her carefully calculating her breaking point. "By tomorrow night, there will be a $250,000 bounty on your head. They will release your face to every crooked cop, every street dealer, and every ambitious triggerman in the city." Maeve took a step backward, hitting the edge of a stainless steel surgical tray. The metal rattled sharply. "So what happens now? You drop me in a ditch, give me a fake passport, and put me on a bus to nowhere. A fake passport buys you a week before Kovac's digital guys track you down," Roman said, dismissing the idea entirely. "There is only one place you can go where Elias's people cannot reach you." "Where? With me?" Roman held her gaze, the intensity in his eyes almost suffocating. "I run a rival organization. Kovac and I have been engaged in a cold war for 3 years. Tonight it went hot. My estate is a fortress. It is heavily guarded, digitally scrubbed, and entirely off the grid." Maeve let out a harsh, incredulous laugh that scraped her dry throat. "You want me to move into a Mafia safe house? I'm a waitress, not a gangster." You pulled a trigger without hesitation. You kept your hand steady while applying pressure to a fatal wound. "You aren't a waitress anymore," Roman stated bluntly. "You are my responsibility." "I don't belong to you." Maeve snapped her anger, flaring, burning away the terror. "I saved your life because it was the only option on the menu. That doesn't make me your property." Roman didn't flinch at her tone. In fact, a flicker of genuine respect crossed his features, though it was quickly buried behind his stoic facade. "I am not offering you a collar, Maeve. I am offering you a shield," Roman said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "You come to my estate. You stay within the perimeter. You are provided for food, shelter, security. In exchange, you do exactly what Declan tells you when he tells you. You do not ask questions about the business. You do not interfere." "And when does it end?" Maeve demanded, gripping the edge of the metal tray to keep her hands from shaking. "It ends when Kovac is dead and his syndicate is ashes," Roman replied with absolute, terrifying certainty. "Until then, your life is paused." Maeve stared at him. The man lying in the bed wasn't just a criminal. He was an apex predator, currently licking his wounds. She knew with absolute clarity that stepping into his world would permanently stain her soul. But the alternative was waiting in the dark for a bullet to find her. She thought of the squalid diner, the endless stack of bills, the sheer grinding exhaustion of her previous life. It was gone. "I want my own room," Maeve said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the machines. "And you buy Barnaby the expensive wet food." Roman stared at her for a long moment, dissecting the absolute absurdity of her demands given the circumstances. Slowly his head fell back against the pillows. "Done," he whispered. The transition from the subterranean clinic to the surface world happened in a blur of exhaustion. Maeve didn't remember getting into a different vehicle, but suddenly she was sitting in the back of a blacked-out Range Rover. The leather here was charcoal, untouched by violence. The engine was a low, powerful thrum that vibrated through the soles of her borrowed sweatpants. She stared out the window. The city skyline had long since vanished, replaced by an endless, suffocating tunnel of ancient pine trees. It was pitch black outside the headlights, cutting a desperate path through the driving rain. She felt the phantom kick of the handgun in her palms. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical echo. Her wrists throbbed. The muscles in her forearms were pulled tight, vibrating with residual adrenaline. She closed her eyes and pressed the back of her head against the cool glass, trying to focus on the smell of the car's interior. New car smell, masking the distinct metallic scent of stress sweat that clung to her own skin. 10 minutes, Declan said from the front seat. He was driving again. The man seemed immune to fatigue, a machine fueled purely by orders and black coffee. Maeve didn't reply. What was there to say, "Thank you for kidnapping me for my own protection"? The absurdity of it all was beginning to curdle into a dull, heavy resentment. The Range Rover slowed, the tires crunching onto a long, winding gravel driveway. Massive wrought-iron gates materialized from the gloom, flanked by stone pillars that looked centuries old. The gates didn't swing open. They slid back with a heavy industrial grind that spoke of reinforced steel and hydraulic motors. Cameras, small and black, tracked their movement from the tree line. They pulled up to the main house. It wasn't a mansion. Mansions were meant to be shown off. This was a fortress built to look like a sprawling brutalist compound. Heavy stone, narrow windows, flat roofs. It sat in the middle of nowhere, brooding in the storm. Declan killed the engine. Inside, Maeve stepped out into the freezing downpour. The cold hit her like a physical blow, shocking her system back online. She hurried up the wide stone steps behind Declan, slipping through a heavy oak door that clicked shut behind them with the terrifying finality of a bank vault. The interior was jarring. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled of lemon oil beeswax and cold marble. The entryway was cavernous, lit by low amber sconces that cast long, distorted shadows across the slate floor. There were no photographs, no coats thrown casually over a chair. It was a space designed to intimidate, not to welcome. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a severely pressed grey cardigan, stood waiting in the hall. Beside her on the floor was a battered plastic pet carrier. A low demonic growl was vibrating from inside the plastic box. "Barnaby," Maeve breathed. She dropped to her knees on the cold slate, ignoring the ache in her shins. She unlatched the wire door. An orange blur exploded from the carrier, a mass of claws and hissing fury. Barnaby scrambled up Maeve's chest, digging his claws into the oversized fleece shirt, and buried his head under her chin. He smelled like wet fur and absolute panic. Maeve wrapped her arms around the heavy cat, burying her face in his neck. For the first time all night, a hot, jagged tear leaked from the corner of her eye, burning a trail through the dried grime on her cheek. She didn't sob. She just held on to the only piece of her real life that was left. "I am Mrs. Gable," the older woman said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. She looked at the cat with mild distaste, then at Maeve with something resembling pity. "Your room is on the second floor, east wing. I suggest you bathe." "Thank you," Maeve whispered, standing up slowly. Barnaby clung to her like a burr, his tail flicking in agitated, jerky motions. Mrs. Gable led her up a sweeping, carpeted staircase. The silence in the house was oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that swallowed sound whole, making every footstep feel unnaturally loud. They walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, lined with closed doors, stopping at the very end. Fresh clothes are in the wardrobe. Toiletries in the bath. Mrs. Gable instructed, opening the door. Do not wander the grounds at night. The perimeter guards shoot first. Without waiting for a response, the housekeeper turned and walked away, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the runner rug. Maeve stepped into the room and closed the door. The lock engaged with a heavy, satisfying thunk. The bedroom was massive, decorated in muted tones of slate and charcoal. A king-sized bed dominated the center, piled high with crisp white linen and heavy duvets. Floor-to-ceiling curtains were drawn tight against the storm. It was luxurious. It was flawless. It made Maeve want to throw up. She walked into the attached bathroom, peeling Barnaby off her chest and setting him gently on the heated tile floor. He immediately slunk into the corner, eyeing the massive glass shower enclosure with profound suspicion. Maeve turned on the water, letting it run scalding hot. She stripped off the borrowed sweats, avoiding her reflection in the vast mirror above the double vanity. She didn't want to see the bruises forming on her arms or the hollowed-out look she knew was currently inhabiting her eyes. She stepped under the spray. The hot water hit her skin, melting the dried grime, the sweat, and the lingering smell of the diner. She scrubbed her skin with a rough loofah until it was bright red, violently scrubbing away the sensation of the heavy gun grip, the splatter of blood on the pastry case, the wet rattle of Elias's destroyed throat. She stood there until the water ran cold, shivering violently, utterly alone in a Mafia fortress. Time didn't flow at the estate. It stagnated. 4 days blurred into an indistinguishable smear of rain-slicked windows and heavy, suffocating silence. Maeve learned the rhythms of the house by sound, alone. The crunch of gravel at dawn as shifts changed, the low, distant thud of target practice from somewhere deep in the woods, the soft clinking of silverware when Mrs. Gable left a tray of immaculate, tasteless food outside her door 3 times a day. Maeve paced. The carpet in her room was thick enough to swallow her footsteps, but she wore a path between the heavy oak wardrobe and the window overlooking the grey, churning lake at the back of the property. She wasn't a hostage, not technically. The door wasn't locked from the outside, but the psychological barrier was 10 feet thick and made of reinforced steel. She was a waitress, hiding from a cartel. Stepping out of the room felt like stepping off a cliff. By the 4th night, the cabin fever broke her. It was 3 a.m. Barnaby was asleep at the foot of the massive bed, dead to the world. Maeve was staring at the ceiling, her brain cycling through a toxic loop of unpaid bills, the metallic taste of adrenaline, and the fact that she hadn't spoken a word out loud in 96 hours. She threw off the silk sheets. They were too smooth, too frictionless. She missed the scratchy, pill-covered cotton blend of her cheap mattress back in the city. She pulled on a pair of dark leggings and an oversized grey sweater she'd found in the wardrobe, shoving her feet into her old battered sneakers. They felt grounding. She opened her door. The hallway was empty, lit only by the low amber sconces. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed out of the grey room. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors by memory, following the faint, ambient hum of a massive refrigerator unit she'd heard on her first night. It led her downstairs past the cavernous entryway and into the kitchen. It was an industrial culinary masterpiece. Stainless steel prep tables, dual commercial ovens, a walk-in freezer. It was terrifyingly clean. It smelled faintly of harsh citrus cleaner and old copper piping. Maeve walked over to the sprawling marble island. There, sitting in the dark, was a heavy glass jar of coffee beans and a complex, intimidating espresso machine. She didn't want a perfectly pulled shot of espresso. She wanted a burnt, acidic drip coffee from a cracked glass decanter. She started opening heavy oak cabinets, searching for a standard coffee maker, ignoring the jarring clatter the wood made in the dead quiet. "Top shelf, to your left." Maeve jumped, a sharp gasp ripping from her throat. She spun around her shoulder, slamming into the cabinet door. Roman was sitting in the darkest corner of the kitchen, partially obscured by the shadow of a massive pantry door. He was slumped in a heavy wooden chair, a lowball glass of amber liquid resting on the table in front of him. He looked terrible. The sharp-tailored menace from the diner was completely absent. He wore dark grey sweatpants and a black undershirt. His skin was pasty, glistening with a thin sheen of cold sweat. He was breathing shallowly, his left arm wrapped tightly around his midsection, pressing against the bulky bandages hidden beneath his shirt. He hadn't shaved. Dark stubble shadowed his hollowed-out jawline. Maeve's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she forced her hands to drop from her chest. "Are you supposed to be out of bed?" "Are you?" Roman countered. His voice was a dry, scraping rasp. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the amber liquid in his glass. "I live here now, apparently. I'm exploring my cage." Maeve said, her voice defensive, sharp with 4 days of isolation. She turned back to the cabinets, found a simple French press on the top left shelf, and yanked it down. "I'm making coffee. It's 3 in the morning. I work the graveyard shift." Maeve snapped back her hands, moving aggressively as she grabbed the jar of beans. "Or I did, before I shot a Mafia prince over a cup of burnt decaf." Roman fell silent. The only sound was the harsh, grinding noise of Maeve forcing the beans through an electric grinder. It was obnoxiously loud. When it stopped, the silence rushed back in heavier than before. She boiled water in an electric kettle, poured it over the grounds, and leaned against the cold marble counter, crossing her arms. She watched him. He reached for the glass. His hand was trembling. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable shake. He managed to lift the glass halfway to his mouth before a spasm of pain seized his side. He flinched, his breath hitching sharply. The glass slipped, clattering heavily against the wooden table. The whiskey splashed over the rim, soaking into the dark grain. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth, his hand pressing desperately against his ribs. Maeve didn't think. She pushed off the counter. She walked over to the table, the rubber soles of her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished tile. She grabbed a clean dish towel from the counter and tossed it over the spilled whiskey. She didn't ask if he was okay. It was a stupid question. She grabbed the glass, tilting it slightly to ensure the outside was dry, and then she held it out to him. Roman opened his eyes. He looked at the glass, then up at her face. He hated the vulnerability. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the furious dark storm brewing in his slate-grey eyes. He was a man who commanded empires entirely undone by a shattered rib cage and fragmented lead. "I don't need a nurse," he ground out. "Good, because I don't have a degree," Maeve said flatly. She didn't withdraw the glass. "Take the drink, Roman, before you pass out, and I have to drag you back to whatever medical wing Declan has you locked in." It was the first time she had used his name. It hung in the air between them, sharp and intimate, in the sterile metallic smell of the kitchen. He stared at her hand holding the glass. Her knuckles were rough red from harsh soap, the nails filed short and unpainted. They weren't the hands of the women he usually surrounded himself with. They were hands that worked for a living, hands that had pulled a trigger to keep him breathing. Slowly fighting the tremor in his muscles, Roman reached up. He wrapped his fingers around the glass, his skin brushing against hers. He was freezing. He downed the whiskey in one agonizing swallow, setting the glass back on the table with a dull thud. "The coffee," Roman breathed, leaning back against the chair, his eyes dropping shut again. pour me a cup." Steam plumed from the spout of the French press, carrying the harsh, burnt scent of dark roast into the sterile chill of the kitchen. Maeve leaned her weight on the metal plunger. It scraped against the glass cylinder with a gritty, unpleasant friction that set her teeth on edge. She poured the muddy black liquid into 2 heavy ceramic mugs she had dug out of a bottom drawer. They didn't match the immaculate aesthetic of the estate. One was chipped at the rim, a remnant of whatever life this house held before it became a fortress. She picked up the chipped mug, walked back over to the shadows, and slid it across the wooden table. It stopped inches from Roman's hand. "Careful," Maeve warned, her voice flat. "It's terrible." Roman didn't respond immediately. He stared at the rising steam, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful increments. Finally, he hooked a single finger through the handle and dragged the mug closer. He lifted it, taking a slow, deliberate sip. He didn't wince at the heat or the bitter, sludgy taste of over-extracted beans. "I've had worse," he murmured, setting the mug down. "I highly doubt that." Maeve dragged a chair out from the opposite side of the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the tile. She sat, pulling her knees up to her chest, wrapping the oversized grey sweater around her legs. She held her own mug with both hands, letting the ceramic burn the lingering cold out of her palms. Silence descended again, but it felt marginally less suffocating than the quiet in her bedroom. The storm outside had weakened to a steady rhythmic drizzle tapping against the bulletproof glass. Roman shifted in his chair, attempting to find a position that didn't pull at his torn muscles. He failed. A sharp exhale hissed through his teeth, and his grip on the table edge turned white-knuckled. "You shouldn't be on this floor," Maeve said, staring into her black coffee. "If those stitches rip, I'm not sewing you back together. Declan scares me, and I don't want to explain why you bled out next to the espresso machine. Declan is currently sleeping." Roman rasped his voice, sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "And Harrison pumped me so full of morphine I can barely feel my own teeth. I came down because the walls in the medical wing smell like rubbing alcohol. It was making me nauseous." Maeve looked up at him. Without the tailored suits and the terrifying entourage, he was just a deeply damaged man trying to survive his own life. The heavy bruising along his jawline was turning a sickly yellow-green. "So you came to the kitchen to smell bleach instead," she noted dryly. A microscopic twitch hit the corner of his mouth. It was the ghost of a smile buried under layers of pain and exhaustion. "It's an improvement." He picked up the mug again, letting the heat soak into his pale skin. His slate-grey eyes drifted from the coffee to her face, studying her with that same unsettling, calculated intensity she remembered from booth 3. He took in the dark circles, bruising the skin under her eyes, the messy knot of hair secured with a cheap elastic, the defensive posture of her drawn-up knees. "You haven't asked for a phone," Roman stated. "It wasn't a question." "Who would I call?" Maeve asked, a bitter edge creeping into her tone. "My landlord to tell him to keep the security deposit. My manager at the diner to tell him I quit. I don't have family, Roman. Just Barnaby. And a pile of utility bills you generously left behind to burn. It makes it easier. Being entirely alone." Maeve let out a short, hollow laugh that held zero humor. "Yeah, it's a real blessing. Having nothing they can use against you," Roman corrected his voice, dropping an octave, losing the morphine haze and finding its sharp edge. "Kovac operates on leverage. He finds what you love and he puts a knife to its throat. You have no leverage. That makes you dangerous." Maeve rubbed her thumb against the chipped rim of her mug. The ceramic felt rough grounding. "I shot a man because he was going to kill me. That makes me desperate, not dangerous. I don't know how to exist in this." She gestured vaguely to the cavernous, immaculate kitchen and the invisible empire it represented. You observe. You adapt, Roman said simply. He leaned back, the wood of the chair creaking under his weight. You didn't hesitate when Elias raised his weapon. You didn't panic when the blood hit the floor. You shoved a pillow into a gunshot wound while threatening my driver. He met her eyes, the slate grey, boring directly into hers. You are already existing in this, Maeve. You just haven't accepted it yet. The brutal honesty of his words hit her squarely in the chest. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream that she was just a waitress, that this was a temporary nightmare, that she would go back to serving burnt coffee to weary travelers. But she looked at the man sitting across from her, smelling the gunpowder, still phantom lingering in her own hair. "When does the war start?" Maeve asked quietly. Roman took a final sip of the terrible coffee. He set the mug down, the sound echoing softly in the vast, empty house. "It started the second you pulled that trigger. That wraps up the explosive beginning of Maeve and Roman's story. From a greasy diner floor to a heavily guarded Mafia estate, she traded minimum wage for a front-row seat to a violent cartel war. But Maeve isn't the type to sit quietly in a gilded cage, and Kovac's men are already hunting for blood. If you felt your pulse pound through this dark, gritty standoff, smash that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss Part 10. Share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts and drop a comment below. How long would you survive in Roman's fortress?